What happens when a 9-month pregnant wife, armed with ironclad divorce papers, and the federal police crashes her billionaire husband's romantic yacht getaway with his mistress? This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a tale of epic betrayal, meticulous revenge, and the day a powerful man learned that the woman he underestimated was the one who would orchestrate his spectacular downfall. We're about to set sail into the heart of a tempest on the shimmering Amalfi Coast, where the turquoise water is about to be stained with secrets and lies. Stay tuned as we expose the moment a gilded empire built on deceit came crashing down in the most public and humiliating way possible. The sun over the Amalfi Coast was a painter's dream, a molten gold orb melting into a sky of impossible blue. Below the Mediterranean Sea was a dazzling blanket of turquoise and sapphire, so clear you could see the shadows of fish darting deep beneath the surface. It was upon this perfect canvas that the Serenity floated a monument to obscene wealth and refined power. She wasn't merely a yacht. She was a 300-foot feedship masterpiece, a floating palace of polished teak, gleaming chrome and glass that seemed to merge with the water itself. Her owner, Julian Croft, stood on the aft deck, a man who mirrored his vessel sleek, powerful, and impeccably polished. Julian was a titan of the financial world, a hedge fund manager who played with markets the way a god might play with mortals. He hadn't just been born into money. He had taken his family's considerable fortune and multiplied it with a ferocity that terrified his rivals. He had a predator's smile eyes, the color of old money, and a charisma so potent it could bend reality to his will. At 42, he believed himself invincible, a modern-day king, surveying his kingdom from the deck of his warship. Draped over a plush sun lounger near him was Sienna, a woman whose beauty was as breathtaking as the Positano coastline clinging to the cliffs in the distance. At 24, she was a confection of sun-kissed skin, honey-blonde hair, and a figure that had launched 1,000 Instagram campaigns. She was an influencer, a model, a brand ambassador, a professional beauty, whose currency was desire. She held a flute of Dom Perignon Rosé, the pale pink liquid catching the afternoon light. "Is it always this perfect, Jewel?" she murmured, her voice a sultry purr. She shifted the tiny triangles of her designer bikini, doing little to conceal her ambitions. "Or did you arrange the sunset just for me?" Julian chuckled, a low, confident sound that rumbled in his chest. He moved to her side, his shadow falling over her. "For us, darling, I only deal in perfection." He ran a hand down her arm, his touch proprietary. "You're enjoying the Serenity. She's overwhelming." Sienna breathed, tilting her head back to look at him. "I've been on yachts before. Sponsored trips to Dubai, a weekend thing, with a music producer in Miami. But this..." She gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings, the infinity pool that seemed to spill into the ocean, the discreet crew members who anticipated every need before it was voiced. "This is different. This is power." "It's a tool," Julian corrected gently, though her observation pleased him. "A place to escape the noise, the endless demands." He conveniently left out that the primary demand he was escaping was from his 9 months pregnant wife, Annalise. Annalise with her quiet strength, her intelligent eyes, and her inconveniently timed pregnancy. He had told her he was closing a delicate merger in Zurich. A necessary trip, he'd said, his voice laced with feigned regret. He'd kissed her belly, a theatrical gesture for a child he wasn't sure he wanted, and promised to be back in time for her final doctor's appointment. Annalise. The name felt like a phantom limb on the yacht, an unwelcome ghost at their decadent feast. She was his wife, the elegant and stable partner who looked so good at charity galas and on the society pages. An art historian from a good but not wealthy family, she was the anchor that made his high-flying life socially acceptable. But anchors could also be chains. Lately, her quiet observations had started to feel like judgments, her questions a little too perceptive. Her pregnancy, which should have been a crowning achievement, felt like a closing cage. Sienna, on the other hand, was the opposite of a cage. She was a breath of fresh, unencumbered air. She didn't care about his portfolio's ethical implications or the late hours he kept. She cared about the sparkle of the diamond bracelet he'd gifted her, the number of likes on the photos she'd artfully tagged from the yacht, and the promise of a future where she would be the one at the galas. Another bottle? I think Julian declared, snapping his fingers. A steward clad in crisp white materialized instantly. And bring the beluga, the good stuff. As the steward retreated, Sienna sat up, her eyes gleaming. You know, she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, I was thinking about us, about the future. Julian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. This was the part of the script he disliked, the inevitable pivot from carefree fun to expectations. The future is a beautiful sunny day, just like this one. But the nights are long, Jules, she countered, refusing to be dismissed. And they can be lonely. What happens when this trip is over? You go back to her. To the wife. She said the word wife, as if it were a disease. Annalise and I have an arrangement, he said coolly. A well-worn lie that even he was starting to find thin. It's complicated. Uncomplicate it. Sienna urged, her hand now on his thigh, her nails tracing patterns on the fabric of his linen trousers. She has to know, deep down. Women always know. Why drag it out? Imagine the life we could have. No secrets, just this, always. Julian looked out at the horizon. The thought was tempting. A clean slate, a life with a woman who was a beautiful accessory, not a partner who saw the cracks in his facade. He was tired of the double life, the careful partitioning of his world. Maybe Sienna was right. Maybe it was time to uncomplicate things. He could give Annalise a generous settlement, more than generous. She and the baby would be set for life. She was a practical woman. She would see the logic. He was so lost in the intoxicating fantasy of his own freedom that he didn't immediately register the second vessel. It wasn't one of the small, charming fishing boats that dotted the coast, nor was it a tourist-packed ferry. This was a different kind of boat, a sleek, dark-hulled river, fast and purposeful, cutting through the calm water with an unnerving precision. It was heading directly for them. Sienna noticed it first. Looks like we have visitors. Did you invite more friends? Julian frowned. He hadn't. He valued his privacy above all else. No one was supposed to know he was here. He'd used a shell corporation to book the mooring and filed a false itinerary for the Serenity. He watched as the Reaver slowed its engines, dropping to a low growl as it maneuvered alongside his yacht. The crew of the Serenity looked equally perplexed, their professional calm ruffled. On the deck of the Reaver, 3 figures came into view. 2 were men in the crisp dark blue uniforms of the Guardia di Finanza, the Italian financial police. Their faces were impassive, their presence an immediate and jarring note of authority. Between them stood a woman. Julian's blood ran cold. The ocean seemed to tilt the golden sun dimming. The woman was his wife, Annalise. She was not tearful or distraught. Her face was a mask of serene, cold fury. Her 9-month pregnant belly was prominent beneath a simple but elegant white dress. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her eyes, which he had always praised for their warmth, were now like chips of ice. In one hand, she clutched a thick leather portfolio. Julian felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a child, who had been caught in a serious transgression, the icy grip of pure, unadulterated fear. Sienna let out a small, confused gasp, pulling a silk robe around herself. "Jules, who is that? Is that?" Annalise's gaze swept over the deck, taking in the scene. The champagne, the caviar, the half-naked mistress with a chilling lack of surprise, as if she were merely confirming data she already possessed. Her eyes finally landed on her husband, and in that moment, Julian Croft, the invincible Titan, knew that his perfectly curated world was about to be torn apart at the seams. The storm had arrived, and it had a name: Annalise. The air on the deck of the Serenity grew thick and heavy, the joyful pop of the champagne cork now a distant mocking echo. The yacht's crew, trained to handle any situation with discreet efficiency, seemed paralyzed, caught between their duty to their employer and the undeniable authority of the uniformed officers now preparing to board. A member of the Serenity's crew lowered a boarding ladder, his movements stiff and uncertain. Annalise ascended first, her steps measured and steady, despite her advanced pregnancy. She moved with a purpose that was terrifying to behold. She did not stumble. She did not waver. She carried herself not like a scorned wife, but like a queen about to pronounce a sentence. The 2 officers of the Guardia di Finanza followed her, their polished boots landing on the pristine teak deck with an ominous thud. Julian finally found his voice, forcing it into a semblance of his usual commanding tone. "Annalise, what in God's name is this? What are you doing here? You should be in New York." Annalise didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flickered from Julian to Sienna, who was now standing clutching her robe like a shield. It was a brief, dismissive glance, the kind one might give to a piece of furniture that was about to be repossessed. Then her eyes locked back onto Julian's. "Hello, Julian," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. It was the lack of hysteria that struck him the hardest. There was no screaming, no sobbing, just a terrifying, glacial composure. "I believe we have some things to discuss, and some paperwork to sign." She opened the leather portfolio. From it, she produced a thick stack of documents bound in blue. She held them out to him. "These," she announced, her voice ringing with clarity across the silent deck, "are divorce papers. They cite infidelity among other things. I think you'll find the evidence attached to be quite thorough." Julian stared at the papers as if they were a venomous snake. His face, usually a mask of charming confidence, cycled through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, and then a rising tide of pure rage. "You're insane," he snarled, taking a step forward. "You track me down here pregnant to pull a stunt like this. We will discuss this in private. Now tell your companions to leave my yacht." One of the officers, a stern-faced man with a thick moustache and the rank of Maresciallo, stepped forward. "Signor Croft," he said, in heavily accented but clear English. "We are not her companions. We are officers of the Guardia di Finanza. We are here on official business." Sienna, who had been frozen in place, finally spoke. "Jules, what's going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are these people?" "Stay out of this, Sienna." Julian snapped, not even looking at her. His entire focus was on Annalise, this stranger who wore his wife's face. "This is a private matter." "It stopped being a private matter, Julian," Annalise said, her voice cutting through the air like glass. "When you started using our joint accounts and assets to fund your extracurricular activities." She gestured vaguely towards Sienna. "And it became a state matter when you started using those same channels to hide your money." A new, more profound dread began to seep into Julian's bones, colder and deeper than the fear of divorce. "What are you talking about? Hide my money?" "That's a ridiculous accusation." The Maresciallo spoke again, his tone brooking no argument. "Signor Croft, we have a warrant to search this vessel and to seize certain electronic devices and documents. This warrant is issued based on a formal complaint and preliminary evidence suggesting significant financial crimes, including tax evasion and money laundering." Julian felt as if the deck had been ripped out from under him. Tax evasion, money laundering. These were not just words. They were specters that haunted men like him, the only real threats to their power. But he was careful. He was meticulous. He had the best lawyers and accountants in the world. How could this be happening? He looked at Annalise, a horrific realization dawning in his eyes. Her calm, her control, the presence of the financial police. It was all connected. "You," he whispered the single word, dripping with venomous accusation. "You did this." Annalise met his gaze without flinching. "I did," she confirmed, a flicker of something, not triumph, but grim satisfaction in her eyes. "You seem to have forgotten that my father was a forensic accountant before he retired. He taught me that numbers never lie. And your numbers, Julian, have been telling a fascinating story for the past 3 years." The portfolio in her hand held more than just divorce papers. It held his life's secrets. Julian felt his world spin. Annalise, his quiet, unassuming wife, the art historian he thought was content arranging flowers and planning dinner parties, had been poring over his finances. She had been collecting evidence. The trips he'd coded as business development in Monaco, the art purchases from obscure galleries that were really shell companies, the wire transfers to untraceable accounts in the Cayman Islands. He thought he had hidden it all behind a labyrinth of corporate complexity. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated her. He had seen her as part of the scenery of his life, not as a player in the game. "Why?" He choked out the question, raw with disbelief. Annalise's composure finally cracked just for a second. A wave of genuine pain washed over her face before being suppressed by sheer force of will. "Why?" She repeated, her voice trembling slightly before steadying. "You want to know why? Look at her, Julian." She finally pointed a finger directly at Sienna, who flinched as if struck. "You stood in a church and made vows to me. You put your hand on my belly and swore you loved our child. And all the while you were spending our money, our future on this, on disposable women and a life built on lies." She took a deep breath. "I mourned our marriage for months, Julian. I cried myself to sleep in the beautiful empty mansion you bought for me. And then one day I realized that tears wouldn't protect my child. My child deserves a father who is present and honest, or he deserves a fortune built on something other than his father's crimes. Since you couldn't be the former, I decided to secure the latter." She turned to the Maresciallo. "Officer, the main server for the yacht's financial and communication logs is in the captain's study. His personal laptop, which he uses for his private hedge fund transactions, is likely in the master suite." I would also suggest you look for a specific piece of art, a small sculpture by a forged artist he calls Ricci. It was purchased for 7 figures through a gallery in Geneva that doesn't actually exist. The payment was routed through 3 different shell corporations. That was the loose thread I pulled on. The Maresciallo nodded, impressed by her precision. He gestured to his partner. Begin the search. Secure all laptops, phones, and paper records. Confine Signor Croft to the main salon. Julian was dumbfounded. He was being given orders on his own yacht. His sanctuary had become his prison. "You can't do this," he roared, lunging not at the officers, but at Annalise. "You treacherous bitch! You've ruined me!" Before he could take 2 steps, the second officer, younger and faster, intercepted him, grabbing his arm in a powerful grip. Julian struggled for a moment, his expensive Tom Ford shirt straining at the seams before realizing the futility of it. The fight went out of him, replaced by a chilling stillness. The king had been checkmated. Annalise watched, her expression unreadable. She turned her attention back to the divorce papers, which had fallen to the deck in the scuffle. She picked them up, smoothed them out, and placed them firmly on an outdoor dining table. "My lawyer will be in touch with yours, Julian," she said, her voice once again devoid of emotion. "Assuming, of course, that you can still afford one." With that final devastating blow, she turned her back on him, on Sienna, on the life they had shared. She walked towards the boarding ladder, her posture erect, her white dress a beacon against the darkening blue of the sea. She had come, she had conquered, and now she was leaving the wreckage for him to drown in. As she descended back to the Riva, leaving Julian in the custody of the police on the deck of his seized vessel, the setting sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the world's most beautiful coastline into a sudden, unforgiving twilight. As the sleek Riva carrying Annalise sliced through the turquoise water, shrinking into a defiant speck against the grandeur of the Amalfi coastline, a vacuum of sound and energy formed on the deck of the Serenity. It was as if she had taken all the air with her. The pop of the champagne cork, the seductive music that had been playing softly, the easy laughter, all were now phantom echoes in a place that had transformed from a sanctuary into a crime scene. Julian stood rooted to the polished teak, the divorce papers Annalise had placed on the table, fluttering mockingly in the sea breeze. His world, once a solid, predictable structure built on the foundations of his own invincibility, had begun to liquefy. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, the kind one experiences when looking down from a great height, only he was looking up at the ruins of his own life. The sun felt too bright, the air too thin. He was the king of this vessel, the master of his universe. Yet the quiet authority with which the Guardia di Finanza officers moved through his space rendered him a ghost. One officer spoke quietly into his radio in Italian, his words sharp and clinical. The other began a methodical sweep of the deck, his eyes missing nothing. They ignored Julian, their indifference a more profound insult than any aggression could have been. He was no longer a player to be contended with. He was simply the subject of an investigation, an object to be managed. His gaze fell on Sienna. She was a statue carved from fear, still clutching the silk robe to her throat, as if it could ward off the disaster unfolding around her. The sun-kissed glow was gone from her skin, replaced by a pallid, clammy sheen. Her eyes, wide and terrified, darted from the officers to Julian, searching for an explanation, an escape route, a sign that the powerful man she had attached herself to was about to fix this. Julian's survival instincts honed in the cutthroat world of high finance finally clawed their way through the fog of his shock. He needed a plan. He needed control. "Sienna," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "My phone. The black one. Get it and call Alex Vanguard. His number is pinned. Tell him I have a situation here. A domestic dispute that's gotten out of hand. Tell him to get on a plane." Sienna stared at him, her lips slightly parted. The command, the expectation that she would be his functional assistant in the middle of this chaos, seemed to baffle her. "Alex Vanguard. Your lawyer, Jules. What is happening?" They said money laundering." She whispered the words as if they were a curse that might be invoked by speaking them aloud. "It's nonsense," Julian snapped, his voice cracking with a rage born of pure terror. "It's my wife. She's unwell, unstable. It's a revenge fantasy. Alex will shut this down in a matter of hours. Now get the phone." But she didn't move. Her feet, clad in delicate golden sandals, seemed fused to the deck. The self-preservation instinct, far more potent than any loyalty to him, was screaming at her. A domestic dispute didn't come with federal police and warrants. Making that call felt like deliberately shackling herself to him. She wasn't just his girlfriend anymore. She'd be an accessory, a co-conspirator. My things are inside," she stammered, taking a half-step back. It was a retreat, and they both knew it. Julian's eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. He saw the calculation in her terrified face the moment she mentally weighed the benefits of staying with him against the risks. He saw himself losing her, too. "Sienna," he warned, the word a low growl. "Don't you dare walk away from me." But his threats were empty. The power had shifted. He was no longer the protector, the benefactor. He was the liability. With a final frightened glance, she turned and fled into the cool, air-conditioned interior of the yacht, leaving him utterly alone with the silent judging officers. The origins of this perfectly executed demolition did not begin with a private investigator or a dramatic confrontation. It began almost a year prior in the sterile silence of their Fifth Avenue triplex, a home so vast and pristine it felt more like a private museum than a place where people lived. Julian was away, supposedly, at a tech conference in Seattle. Annalise, unable to sleep, was paying bills online, a mundane chore that grounded her in the otherwise abstract reality of their immense wealth. And there it was, a single anomalous line item on a joint credit card statement he rarely used. A charge for over 5,000 euros, not from Seattle, but from the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo. It was for the Sweet Princess Grace, a room she knew was one of the most romantic and opulent in the world. It was a clumsy, arrogant mistake, the kind made by a man who had stopped bothering to cover his tracks with any real diligence. For another woman, it might have been the spark that lit a firestorm of tears and accusations. For Annalise, it was a key to a door she hadn't even realized was locked. Her father, a quiet, brilliant man who had spent 40 years as a forensic accountant, had taught her one fundamental truth. Everything leaves a trace. People lie, but numbers don't. Numbers tell a story. Her investigation began that night. Fueled by a cold, quiet dread, she went into Julian's magnificent home office, a room she rarely entered. It was his domain, a temple of dark wood, leather, and technology. She sat in his oversized chair, which still held the faint scent of his expensive cologne, and typed in a password she hadn't used in years, Archie 1998, the name of the golden retriever he'd had as a teenager, a sentimental detail he'd shared during their courtship a piece of himself he'd long since forgotten giving her. The computer unlocked. For hours she navigated through folders of market analyses and corporate reports, a world she had always been content to leave to him. Then she found it. A partition on the hard drive, encrypted and disguised as family archives. Using a decryption key she'd found in a notebook in his desk drawer, the serial number of his first Porsche, another relic of a past he thought was buried. She opened the partition. It was like staring into the abyss. There, laid out in meticulously organized spreadsheets and ledgers, was Julian's real life. It was a second set of books that detailed not a business, but a shadow empire built on deceit. She saw the network of shell corporations with absurd, bland names like Global Asset Holdings and Triton Investment Group, registered in Panama, the Caymans, the British Virgin Islands. She saw the wire transfers coded as consulting fees and acquisitions that flowed into these entities and then disappeared. And she saw the art. Julian had always presented his collecting as a passion, a shared interest between them. But on these ledgers, the art was just another currency. He would buy a sculpture from a gallery in Geneva for $2 million, funneling the money through 3 shell companies, then have the same piece appraised a year later for $5 million, and borrow against it, creating clean cash from thin air. She found the file on the forged artist he'd invented, Marco Ricci. There were fake auction records, forged provenance documents. It was a breathtakingly audacious fraud. Then she found the folder labeled G&E, Gifts and Entertainment. It was a log of his infidelities, recorded with the cold precision of an accountant. Names, dates, cities, and amounts. A diamond necklace for a model in Milan. Rent paid on a condo for a starlet in LA. And the most recent entries, thousands of dollars spent on Sienna R, including first-class flights, designer clothes, and hotel suites. She was not the first. She was just the latest and most expensive. The woman who walked out of that office as the sun rose over Central Park was not the same one who had entered. The grief was a physical force, a crushing weight on her chest. Their marriage, their life, everything she believed in, was a sham. She cried for 3 days, a silent, hollowed-out weeping in a house that felt like a mausoleum. The turning point came on the 4th day. She was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she felt it a distinct fluttering kick from within her womb. It was a message from a future that had nothing to do with Julian's lies. It was her child, a real innocent life that deserved more than a legacy of crime and a father who was a phantom. In that moment, the grief didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It hardened into a diamond-sharp resolve. She would not be a victim. She would not take a settlement and disappear quietly. Tears wouldn't protect her child, but Julian's own money, legally and righteously seized, would. She would not just divorce him. She would dismantle him. She would build a firewall of truth around her child, and she would use the bricks of his own deceit to do it. Annalise became a woman possessed by a singular purpose. She used her own inheritance to hire a discreet forensic accounting firm in Zurich. On a secure video call, she presented her findings to 3 stone-faced Swiss accountants who were accustomed to dealing with the world's wealthiest criminals. They were stunned not just by the scale of the fraud, but by the meticulous, undeniable evidence the art historian wife had gathered. They confirmed her findings and helped her chart the labyrinthine flow of money. She learned the Serenity was his crown jewel, an undeclared asset worth over $100 million registered to a shell corporation in Malta. When she found out through a stray email that he was taking Sienna there to the very symbol of his stolen wealth, she knew she had her stage. The poetic justice was too perfect to ignore. Through a top-tier Italian law firm, she presented her case file to the Guardia di Finanza. It was so complete, so irrefutable that they fast-tracked the warrant. Back in the present on the rocking deck of the yacht, chaos was erupting. Sienna, having failed to get any reassurance from Julian, had made a decision. She emerged from the interior, no longer in her bikini and robe, but dressed in jeans and a sweater. She clutched her oversized, expensive handbag like a life raft, her eyes wild with panic. "I'm leaving," she announced, her voice high and strained. "My driver is waiting at the marina in Positano. I have nothing to do with this." She made a frantic move toward the boarding ladder, but the Maresciallo stepped into her path, a calm, immovable object. "Signorina, I'm afraid that is not possible," he said, his tone polite but firm. "You are a material witness. We have some questions for you." "Witness, I don't know anything," she cried, her voice cracking. "I'm a model. He invited me on a trip, that's all." The second officer approached them, holding the small, beautiful jade statuette they'd found while searching her cabin. It looked elegant and harmless. "Maresciallo, we found this in the signorina's handbag. It corresponds to an item on the list of flagged purchases." Sienna looked at the statue, then back at the officer, her face a mask of confusion. It's a gift. Julian gave it to me last week. It's just a present." The Maresciallo took the statuette, weighing it in his hand. He looked at Sienna, and for the first time a hint of pity entered his eyes. "Signorina Rossi," he said, using her full name and making it sound like a verdict. "This present was purchased for 200,000 euros through a Panamanian corporation called Viridian Trading, which our preliminary investigation shows is a front for laundering art sale proceeds. It is a key piece of physical evidence. You were found in possession of it, attempting to leave the vessel." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I am afraid this complicates your position significantly. You are no longer just a witness." The meaning behind his carefully chosen words crashed down on Sienna with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't an innocent bystander. She wasn't a victim. In the eyes of the law, she was an accomplice, caught red-handed with the spoils of a crime. Her face crumpled, the carefully constructed mask of the glamorous influencer, dissolving to reveal the terrified young woman beneath. A gut-wrenching sob escaped her lips as she sank onto a nearby deck chair, her head in her hands. Julian watched the entire exchange, a cold, bitter laugh catching in his throat. The irony was suffocating. His wife had betrayed him with her intellect. His mistress had unwittingly implicated herself with her greed. Everyone had turned on him. Everyone had abandoned him. He was utterly, completely alone, surrounded by the wreckage of a life he had believed to be perfect. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was not the end. This was just the beginning of his descent into hell. The night fell upon the Amalfi coast not as a gentle blanket, but as a suffocating shroud. A real storm, which had been a distant threat on the horizon, had now muscled its way in, turning the idyllic sea into a violent, churning cauldron of black water and white-capped fury. Rain began to fall first, as hesitant drops, then as a relentless, driving torrent that lashed against the panoramic windows of the main salon. Distant flashes of lightning bleached the sky for a moment, revealing the grotesque dance of the waves, before plunging the world back into a profound, roaring darkness. The Serenity. The pinnacle of maritime engineering groaned under the assault, its gentle rocking replaced by jarring lurches that spoke of the sea's raw power. Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The yacht's warm ambient lighting had been supplemented by the harsh, functional glare of portable lamps brought aboard by the Guardia di Finanza. The officers moved with a quiet, unnerving professionalism, their dark uniforms a stark contrast to the cream and mahogany opulence of the interior. They were ghosts at a feast, systematically cataloguing the evidence of a life that had only hours ago seemed unimpeachable. Every tagged laptop, every bagged phone, every sealed document was another nail in the coffin of Julian Croft's world. Julian was a tiger in a glass cage. He had been pacing the length of the salon for what felt like an eternity, the plush Aubusson carpet doing nothing to soften the harsh impact of his steps. The physical confinement was galling, but it was the loss of control that was eating him alive. For his entire adult life, the world had bent to his will. Markets rose and fell on his command. People answered his calls. Doors opened. Problems vanished. Now he was a spectator to his own dismantling, forced to watch as men with government salaries picked apart his image with meticulous, indifferent hands. His rage had burned itself out, leaving behind the hold-heavy ash of dread. He was trapped, and the architect of his prison was the one person he had never considered a threat. In a guest cabin on the lower deck, Sienna was experiencing her own private hell. The questioning by the Maresciallo had been deceptively polite, yet utterly terrifying. He hadn't accused her of anything directly. He had simply asked questions. When did she meet Signor Croft? What was the nature of their relationship? Had she travelled with him before? Did she know his wife? Was she aware of his business dealings? And then the question about the gifts. He had laid out photos of the Cartier bracelet, the handbags, and finally the small jade statuette they had found in her purse. "This is a lovely piece, Signorina," the officer had said, his voice neutral. Signor Croft was very generous. "Do you know where he acquired it?" Sienna had just shaken her head, her throat tight with fear. The intricate web of shell corporations and laundered money the officer briefly alluded to was a language she didn't speak. She understood brands followers and flattering angles. She did not understand wire fraud or international asset tracing. She was a swimmer who had been happily paddling in the sunlit shallows only to be dragged into the crushing, lightless deep. The officer's final words before leaving her in the cabin echoed in her mind. "You will need to remain on the vessel. You are a material witness, and your possession of this item complicates your position." Complicates your position. The sterile legal phrase was a death sentence to the life she had been building. Her name was now tied to Julian's. The scandal would be her scandal. The headlines would feature her face. She would not be remembered as a successful influencer, but as a billionaire's mistress, a foolish girl caught holding the stolen goods. A desperate primal anger began to bubble up through her terror. An anger at Julian. He had done this to her. He had lied, wrapping his sordid secrets in a glittering package of romance and promises. He had used her, and now he was going to discard her. The fantasy she had nurtured of being the one to finally win him, of becoming Mrs. Croft, shattered into a million pieces, revealing the ugly reality underneath. She wasn't his partner. She was his collateral damage. She needed to see him. She needed to force him to acknowledge what he had done to her. It was this desperate, furious need that propelled her from the cabin and up the stairs to the main salon. When the door opened, Julian looked up, his face a mask of irritation. He saw her not as a fellow victim, but as another complication, another buzzing insect distracting him from the central problem of his own survival. "Julian!" Sienna said, her voice a raw quiver. "I need to talk to you." He waved a dismissive hand. "I have nothing to say to you, Sienna. You should be trying to figure out how to explain that statue to them, not bothering me." The coldness of his tone, the immediate shift of blame, snapped the last thread of her composure. "Don't you dare," she shot back, stepping fully into the room. The Maresciallo, standing discreetly near the main exit, watched them both, his face impassive. "Don't you dare try to pin this on me. You lied to me about everything. Your whole life is a lie. You told me she was an ex-wife in all but name, a business arrangement. You told me it was over." Julian let out a bitter scoff, turning to face her fully. The hunted look in his eyes was replaced by a familiar, cruel arrogance. "And you were so innocent in all of this. The naive little girl, you never once stopped to ask where the money for the 5-star hotels and the private jets came from. Did you? You just held out your perfectly manicured hand and smiled for the camera. You saw exactly what you wanted to see. So don't you dare pretend you're some virginal victim in all of this." His words were like slaps to the face, each one landing with brutal accuracy. He was right in a way. She had chosen not to see. She had willingly participated in the fantasy because the reality of her own life was so much less glamorous. But his hypocrisy was breathtaking. "I have something to tell you, Julian," she said, her voice suddenly low, her hands instinctively wrapping around her flat stomach in a gesture of primal protection. The storm outside unleashed a furious gust of wind that rattled the yacht's frame. "Something that changes everything." Julian rolled his eyes, the master of drama now impatient with anyone else's. "What now? Have you suddenly remembered you're a secret agent working for my rivals? Spare me the melodrama. My life is already a 3-act tragedy." Sienna took a shaky breath, the air thick with unspoken words. The decision to say it here now in front of a police officer was an act of pure desperation. It was the only card she had left to play. "I'm pregnant." The 2 words fell into the tense salon and seemed to absorb all the sound, even the roar of the storm outside. Julian, who had been turning away, froze mid-stride. He slowly turned back, his face a canvas of disbelief. The officer by the door did not move, but a flicker of something professional curiosity perhaps passed through his eyes. "You're what?" Julian whispered, the sound barely audible. "Pregnant." She repeated the word stronger this time, fueled by a cocktail of fear and defiance. "About 2 months along. I have the doctor's report in my purse as proof. I was going to tell you this weekend, on this trip." "I thought it would be perfect." A sob caught in her throat. "I thought you'd be happy." Julian stared at her, his mind struggling to compute this new cataclysmic piece of data. Another pregnancy. Another child. It was impossible. It was a tactical nightmare. And then the cynical, calculating part of his brain took over, dismissing the biological reality and focusing solely on the strategic implication. It was a lie. It had to be. "You're lying," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is a pathetic, desperate Hail Mary to save yourself. You think this makes you a victim in their eyes. You think they'll go easy on the pregnant mistress. It makes you look worse. It makes you look calculating." "I am not lying, Julian," she insisted, hot tears finally spilling down her cheeks, tracing paths through her expensive foundation. "Why would I lie about this? I was scared to tell you. I was scared it would ruin the fantasy, that it would make things too real. But it is real." The Maresciallo finally stepped forward, his presence grounding the hysterical scene in sober reality. "Signorina, Signor Croft, this is not the time or the place." "No!" Sienna shrieked, whirling to face the officer. He needs to hear this. He needs to understand what he has done. He dangles this perfect life in front of me. Promises me the world. He gets me pregnant. And now he wants to throw me away like I'm nothing, because his real wife finally caught up with his lies. Her accusation, raw and visceral, echoed in the salon. It was the ugly, unvarnished truth, stripped of all its charm and romance. Julian stared at her stomach, where a life he had unwittingly created was growing. The news didn't soften him. It didn't spark a flicker of responsibility or compassion. It hardened him. It was just another front in a war. He was losing another messy complication in Annalise's clean, elegant checkmate. He thought of Annalise carrying his heir, the child who would inherit a name he was in the process of destroying. And now Sienna carrying a child who would be born into scandal and shame. The symmetry was almost poetic in its cruelty. A short, sharp, ugly bark of a laugh escaped his lips. It was a sound completely devoid of humor. "Love," he sneered when Sienna whispered that she thought he might love her. "Oh, you poor, stupid girl. Love is a fairy tale for people who can't afford settlements." "This," he said, his arm sweeping to encompass the salon. "The police, the storm raging outside. This is my reality. It's a world of assets and liabilities, and you, my dear, along with your little news, have just become the most significant liability imaginable." The utter cruelty of the statement, the reduction of her and their unborn child to a line item on a balance sheet, finally extinguished the last ember of hope in Sienna's heart. The man she thought she was falling in love with had never existed. He was a phantom, a construct of her own desires. The real man stood before her, and he was a monster. "That is enough," the Maresciallo commanded, his voice sharp with authority. He gestured to his partner. "Escort the Signorina back to her cabin. She is to have no further contact with Signor Croft." Sienna didn't resist. The fight was gone, replaced by a hollow, crushing defeat. She gave Julian one final look, not of love or even sadness, but of pure, crystalline hatred. It was the look of a woman who had seen the devil and had for a time mistaken him for a savior. As she was led away, her shoulders slumped. She was no longer an aspiring star, but just another girl, broken on the wheel of a powerful man's ambition. Julian watched her go, then sank onto the sofa, the fine leather sighing under his weight. He was alone again in the eye of two converging storms. His world was in ruins, betrayed by his wife, abandoned by his mistress, hunted by the law. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. For a moment he allowed himself to feel the full, crushing weight of his defeat. He thought of Annalise, her poise, her planning, her quiet, devastating execution. A sliver of something that felt disturbingly like professional admiration cut through his despair. She hadn't just gotten emotional. She had gotten strategic. She had gathered her weapons, chosen her battlefield, and launched an attack so precise it was almost beautiful in its lethality. He, the great Julian Croft, had been outplayed by the art historian he'd relegated to the background of his life. And then as the storm outside reached its crescendo, a new thought began to form in the wreckage of his mind. It was a cold, dark, and venomous thing, but it was also a lifeline. A plan. Sienna's pregnancy. He had called it a liability. But what if it was an asset? His mind, conditioned for years to find leverage in any situation, began to work furiously. He was being painted as a cold, calculating, financial criminal. But what if he could change the narrative? What if he wasn't a criminal, but a man caught in a tragic love triangle? A man whose vindictive, jealous, and emotionally unstable wife had conspired to ruin him at the exact moment he was about to start a new family with the woman he truly loved. He could leak the story. Anonymously, of course. He could frame Annalise's perfectly legal and justified actions as the hysterical revenge of a woman scorned. He could use Sienna's pregnancy as a shield and a sword. It would muddy the waters. It would transform a clear-cut financial investigation into a sordid, messy tabloid spectacle. It would force Annalise to fight not just in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. It might not save him from prison, but it would wound her deeply. It would tarnish her victory and drag her immaculate reputation through the same gutter he now found himself in. A slow, twisted smile spread across Julian Croft's face. It was the first time he had smiled in hours, and it was a horrifying sight. He was cornered, beaten, and facing ruin. But he wasn't dead yet. He had lost his kingdom, his freedom, his fortune. But he had one thing left: his capacity for cruelty. If he was going down, he would burn the whole world to the ground, and he would make sure Annalise was standing in the center of the blaze. The war, he realized with a jolt of adrenaline, was not over. It had just entered a new, far more vicious phase. So the stage is set for an explosive fallout. A powerful man brought to his knees a wife who became a warrior, and a mistress caught in a crossfire she never anticipated. This was the day the bill for a life of lies came due. But is this the end, or just the beginning of a new, dirtier war? What happens when the legal teams descend and the story hits the tabloids? Can Annalise protect her child and her hard-won freedom or will? Julian's desperation drag her back into the mud with him. If you were captivated by this story of high-stakes drama and intricate revenge, let us know in the comments below. Who do you think will ultimately win this war? Drop a justice for Annalise if you're on her side. Your engagement helps us create more stories like this. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a good story, and most importantly, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of an epic tale. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Astoria Ballroom dripped light like frozen diamonds, illuminating a world of champagne and whispered fortunes. Among the elite, Madeline Cranston felt like a ghost, the delicate fabric of her gown a poor shield against the chilling neglect of her husband, Isidore. He stood across the room, a king in his element, his laughter a sharp sting in her ears. Beside him, Bianca Reed, draped in scarlet, smiled a predator's smile. Madeline, with one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, knew this night was a precipice. She was about to lose everything, and the fall would be witnessed by all. The Cranston name was a dynasty, etched into the steel and glass of the city's skyline. Isidore Cranston, the sole heir to Cranston Holdings, was a man sculpted from privilege and pressure. Madeline had met him not in a boardroom, but in a small, dusty bookstore where she worked while studying art history. He'd been charming, seemingly captivated by her quiet world, a stark contrast to his own. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance that felt like a fairy tale, a prince choosing a commoner. But the moment she said, "I do," the fairy tale began to curdle. The gilded cage of their penthouse apartment, with its panoramic views of the city, started to feel more like a prison. The man who had loved her quiet nature now criticized it as unbefitting a Cranston wife. Her simple tastes were deemed embarrassing her friends from her old life, subtly pushed away. The true ruler of their lives was not Isidore, but his mother, Genevieve Cranston. A woman with eyes like chips of ice and a spine of steel, Genevieve had never approved of Madeline. To her, Madeline was not a daughter-in-law, but a strategic misstep, a temporary impurity in their pristine bloodline. A Cranston wife must be an asset. Madeline, not a liability. Genevieve would say her voice a silken threat during their excruciatingly formal weekly dinners. Your background is a challenge. You must work harder to overcome it. Isidore, once her defender, now sat silently during these lectures, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on his plate. He was a different man, in his mother's presence weaker, more eager to please the charming prince, replaced by a petulant boy. Then Madeline discovered she was pregnant. It was a secret she held close for weeks, a flickering candle of hope in the growing darkness. This, she believed, would change everything. A child and heir would solidify her place in the family. It would bring Isidore back to her, remind him of the love they once shared. When she finally told him, his reaction was muted. There was no joy, no tender embrace. Instead, he stared at her burgeoning belly with a look of detached calculation. "A son, I hope," he'd said before, turning and walking away to take a phone call. "Mother will be pleased." It was then that the name Bianca Reed began to surface. At first, it was a whisper from the staff, a name on a credit card statement Isidore carelessly left on his desk. Bianca was the daughter of a rival family, a woman Genevieve had once championed as a perfect match for Isidore. She was everything Madeline was not: bold, ruthless in her ambition, and born into the same world of cutthroat luxury. Madeline tried to ignore it, to dismiss the late-night texts Isidore received the scent of a strange perfume on his suits. She focused on the upcoming annual Cranston Foundation Gala, the pinnacle of the city's social calendar. This year it was being held at the Grand Astoria Ballroom. She would be poised, graceful, the perfect pregnant wife. She would stand by Isidore's side and prove to Genevieve, to everyone, that she belonged. She chose her dress with meticulous care, a flowing gown of deep sapphire that celebrated her pregnancy rather than hiding it. It was a statement of hope, a silent plea. On the night of the gala, as the chauffeur-driven car pulled up to the red carpet, Isidore finally spoke to her. He didn't look at her, but at their reflection in the tinted window. "Bianca will be there tonight," he said, his voice flat. "Behave yourself. Do not make a scene." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a confession. It was a command. He wasn't asking for her understanding. He was demanding her compliance. The candle of hope she had been nurturing within her flickered violently, threatening to extinguish completely. As she stepped out of the car into the blinding flash of cameras, Madeline knew her performance tonight was not for the society pages, but for her very survival. The Grand Astoria Ballroom was a dizzying spectacle of power and wealth. Conversations were transactions, and smiles were weapons. Madeline navigated the glittering crowd with a practiced grace. She didn't feel her own smile a fragile mask. She accepted hollow congratulations on her pregnancy from people whose names she barely remembered, their eyes darting over her shoulder, searching for someone more important. Isidore had abandoned her the moment they entered, drawn into a circle of powerful men, where billion-dollar deals were discussed over cocktails. Madeline found a quiet alcove near a towering ice sculpture of the Cranston Holdings logo, one hand instinctively cradling her belly. The baby kicked a small, reassuring flutter, and for a moment she felt a surge of strength. This was not just about her anymore. Then she saw her. Bianca Reed was holding court, a vibrant splash of scarlet against the more muted tones of the other guests. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a flute of champagne held aloft. And Isidore was right beside her, his arm resting possessively on the back of her chair. He was smiling a real smile, the kind Madeline hadn't seen directed at her in years. It was a knife twisting in her gut. Genevieve Cranston materialized at Madeline's side, her presence as cold as the ice sculpture next to them. "You see?" Genevieve murmured, her gaze fixed on the couple across the room. "That is what a power couple looks like. Influence lineage. Bianca understands what is required." "He's my husband," Madeline whispered, her voice trembling. "A temporary arrangement," my dear Genevieve replied, turning her chilling eyes on Madeline. "You've served your purpose. Once the child is born, provided it is a healthy son, your role in this family will be re-evaluated. Don't delude yourself into thinking this is a marriage of love." The cruelty of the words stole her breath. She had been nothing more than a vessel, a means to an end. The love she thought she had, the life she thought she was building, it was all a lie, a business transaction she had been too naive to understand. Rage, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. It was a foreign feeling, but a powerful one. She would not be dismissed like a redundant employee. She would not stand by and watch her life be dismantled before her eyes. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and walked across the polished marble floor. The crowd seemed to part for her as she approached Isidore and Bianca's table. Every eye in the room was on her. The whispers followed her like a rustle of dry leaves. Isidore saw her coming, his smile vanishing, replaced by a dark scowl. Bianca, however, simply watched her approach, a look of amused curiosity on her face. Isidore Madeline said, her voice steady, despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "I believe it's time for us to leave." Bianca let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Oh, don't be a bore. The party's just getting started." She looked up at Isidore, her hand stroking his arm. "Your little wife seems tired." "She's right, Isidore. Your pregnant wife is tired," Madeline said, meeting Bianca's gaze with a directness that made the other woman's smile tighten. "It's time to go home. Now." Isidore stood up slowly, his face a mask of thunder. He was embarrassed. In his world, public perception was everything, and his mousy, insignificant wife was daring to challenge him in front of everyone, in front of Bianca. "We'll leave when I say we leave," he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "I won't stand here and be humiliated." Madeline insisted, her newfound courage refusing to desert her. "I am your wife. This child is your heir. You will show us some respect." Bianca laughed again, louder this time. "Respect? Darling, you have to earn respect, and all you've done is trap him with a pregnancy. How very common." The word common hung in the air, a deliberate, poisoned dart. It was Genevieve's word, the ultimate Cranston insult. And hearing it from the lips of her husband's mistress while he did nothing was the final straw. The fragile dam, holding back months of pain and humiliation, finally broke. "You will not speak to me that way," Madeline said, her voice rising. "And you?" She turned to Isidore, her eyes blazing. "Will not allow it." The atmosphere around their table had grown taut, a bubble of silence expanding in the heart of the noisy gala. The music seemed to fade, the chatter of the city's elite dying down, as dozens of pairs of eyes turned to witness the unfolding drama. This was better than any gossip column, more riveting than any market fluctuation. This was the Cranston dynasty exposed and raw. Isidore's face was a mottled canvas of fury and shame. Madeline had done the one thing he could not forgive. She had made him look weak in his own arena, in front of his peers, his mother, and, most importantly, Bianca. His authority had been questioned, his carefully crafted image of control shattered by the one person he considered utterly powerless. "You are making a scene," he seethed, stepping closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. His breath was hot with the smell of expensive whiskey. "You created this scene, Isidore," Madeline retorted, refusing to back down. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was clear. "When you decided to flaunt your affair in front of the entire city. When you forgot you had a wife and a child on the way." Bianca remained seated, watching the exchange with the detached interest of a spectator at a gladiator match. A small, self-satisfied smile played on her lips. She had won. She had pushed Madeline to this point, orchestrated this public implosion, and now she was reaping the rewards. Every pleading, angry word from Madeline's mouth only made her seem more hysterical, more unfit, while Bianca herself remained the picture of poised elegance. "That's enough," Isidore growled. He grabbed Madeline's arm, his fingers digging into her skin like talons. "We are leaving, and you will be silent." Madeline wrenched her arm free. "Don't you touch me." The raw, unvarnished emotion in her voice surprised even herself. "I am not one of your corporate assets. You can silence and control," I said. Isidore repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. "Enough." He moved with a speed that was shocking. His hand, the one that wore the heavy gold Cranston signet ring, flew through the air. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp, definitive, and utterly sickening. It cracked through the ballroom's hushed anticipation like a whip. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. For a frozen second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Madeline's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. A searing, white-hot pain exploded across her cheek. The shock was so profound, so absolute, that it momentarily eclipsed the physical hurt. Time seemed to slow down. She could see the horrified faces of the guests, the stunned expression of the waiter holding a tray of champagne flutes, the wide, disbelieving eyes of a woman she'd been introduced to just an hour earlier. And then her gaze found Bianca. The mistress's smile was no longer small or subtle. It was wide, triumphant, and unapologetic. It was a bourse grotesque expression of victory that reveled in Madeline's utter degradation. In that single hateful smile, Madeline saw the truth of everything. This was what Bianca had wanted. This was the checkmate. Slowly, Madeline raised a trembling hand to her cheek. It came away wet. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of her lip where the ring had cut her. She looked at her husband, the man she had once loved with all her heart, the father of her unborn child. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his own hand. A flicker of something. Was it shock, regret in his eyes? But it was fleeting. His expression hardened again as he met his mother's steely gaze from across the room. He had passed Genevieve's test. He had proven where his loyalties lay. Without a word, Madeline turned. She didn't run. She walked. Head held high, back straight. She moved through the sea of silent, staring faces. Each step was an agony of will. She could feel their pity, their morbid curiosity, their judgment. They were whispers and shadows, and she pushed through them, focusing only on the grand, ornate doors of the ballroom. As she walked, the pain in her cheek began to throb in time with her heartbeat. But a different sensation was rising to meet it, a cold, hard clarity. The gilded cage had not just been opened, it had been utterly demolished. The slap was not an end, it was a beginning. It was the sound of her old life shattering, and in the echoing silence, she would build a new one from the pieces. The last thing she heard before the doors closed behind her was Bianca's soft, victorious laughter. The taxi ride was a blur of smeared city lights and the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers against a sudden downpour. Madeline directed the driver to a part of the city Isidore had never seen, to a small, unassuming brownstone she still owned from before her marriage, her only remaining tether to her old life. She had kept it against the advice of Isidore's lawyers, who had wanted to liquidate all her common assets. Now it was her sanctuary. Inside, the air was stale and dusty. She didn't turn on the lights, sinking to the floor in the darkness of the living room, the sapphire gown pooling around her like spilled ink. The adrenaline that had carried her out of the ballroom receded, leaving behind a pain so vast and hollow it threatened to consume her. Sobs racked her body, and guttural sounds of a heart breaking. She cried for the love she had lost, for the man who had never really existed, for the future that had been stolen from her. She cried until she was empty, until the only sound was the rain lashing against the window panes. She spent the next 2 days in a daze, ignoring the incessant buzzing of her phone. Dozens of calls from Isidore, likely prompted by lawyers for damage control. Texts from concerned friends she had neglected. Voicemails from Genevieve, which she deleted without listening to. The world outside didn't exist. There was only the quiet dustiness of the apartment and the tiny life stirring within her. On the 3rd morning, the sun broke through the clouds. Madeline forced herself to stand, her limbs stiff. She looked at her reflection in a dusty mirror. A bruise, ugly and purple, bloomed across her cheek. Her eyes were swollen, but they held a new hard light. The victim was gone. She needed to think, to plan. She began to sort through old boxes, remnants of her parents who had passed away years ago. Her father, Thomas, had been a university librarian, a quiet gentleman who loved books more than people. Her mother was a freelance artist. They had lived a simple, happy life, and their loss had left a hole in her heart that Isidore had once promised to fill. In a worn leather box filled with her father's personal effects, she found a small, ornate brass key and a sealed envelope addressed to her in his familiar neat script. Her name, Madeline, was written on the front. She'd never seen them before. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter and a single, formal-looking document. "My dearest Madeline," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means you are in a time of great need, and I am no longer there to guide you. I apologize for the secrets I have kept, but I did so only to give you the chance at a normal life, a life of your own choosing, unburdened by the weight of money. I was not just a librarian, my love. That was my passion, but it was not my profession. In my younger years, I was a quantitative analyst and a private equity investor. I was by all accounts very successful. I walked away from that world because I saw what it did to people, how it could corrupt the soul. But I never abandoned the fruits of my labor. The key in this envelope is for a private vault at Sterling Trust Bank on Fifth Avenue. Inside you will find all the documentation you need. I have established a blind trust in your name, managed by my most trusted friend and colleague, a man who is more a brother to me than anything. His name is Walter Hemlock. The contents of this trust are significant. It has been growing, compounding for over 20 years. It is yours and yours alone. It is a legacy of protection, a shield for you in a world that can be cruel. Use it wisely. Use it to be happy. But most of all, use it to be free. All my love, Dad. Madeline read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. A librarian. Her quiet, bookish father was a secret financial genius. She unfolded the other document. It was a summary statement of the trust's assets, dated just 6 months ago. She scanned the columns of numbers, her eyes widening in disbelief. The figures were astronomical, a string of zeros that seemed to defy reality. The estimated value at the bottom of the page was not in the millions, but in the hundreds of millions. And then she saw the list of primary holdings. Her breath hitched. The trust held significant controlling stakes in a dozen major corporations. Near the bottom of the list was a name that made her blood run cold. There, in stark black and white, was a holding of 15% of the Class A voting shares of a publicly traded company, Cranston Holdings. The slap at the gala had been an act of power meant to put her in her place. But her quiet, unassuming father had left her an arsenal. Isidore and Genevieve thought they had all the power that their name and their money made them gods. They had no idea that a quiet librarian had made his daughter their single largest outside shareholder. They had cast her out, humiliated her, and in doing so they had just handed the keys to their kingdom to their greatest enemy. The following day, Madeline walked through the towering bronze doors of the Sterling Trust Bank headquarters on Fifth Avenue. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, a cavernous space of polished marble and hushed reverence where footsteps echoed and money spoke in quiet, confident whispers. This was her father's world, a universe she never knew existed, and she felt like an imposter stepping into its sacred halls. She wore a simple but impeccably tailored black dress, a stark contrast to the vibrant sapphire she had worn to her public execution. The bruise on her cheek was a faint, yellowing shadow under her makeup, a hidden reminder of her purpose. She was escorted not to a teller's window, but to a private elevator that ascended silently to the executive suites. There, in a corner office with a breathtaking view of Central Park, a man with silver hair and kind, intelligent eyes stood to greet her. He was dressed in a classic tweed jacket that seemed more suited to a university library than a bastion of high finance, a detail that immediately put her at ease. "Madeline," he said, his voice warm and gentle, devoid of the pity she had come to dread. "I am Walter Hemlock. Your father was the best man I ever knew. I have been waiting for this day, though I prayed it would never come." He didn't ask about the scandal, her marriage, or the shadows under her eyes. He simply treated her with a quiet, profound respect that felt like a balm on her wounded soul. He led her to a pair of leather armchairs near the window, and for the next hour he didn't speak of numbers or assets. He spoke of her father, Thomas. He called this world the Great Machine. Walter recalled a fond, sad smile on his lips. He was a genius at understanding how it worked, how to make it turn. But he saw what it did to the people who served it. He used to say that numbers could build empires or prisons, and he'd seen too many men build their own gilded prisons. So he walked away. He chose books and a quiet life. He chose you. Tears welled in Madeline's eyes as she listened. Walter was giving her back a piece of her father she never knew, painting a portrait of a man who was not just gentle and kind, but fiercely intelligent and deeply principled. He had not been running from the world. He had conquered it and deemed it unworthy of his soul. Finally, Walter slid a thick leather-bound binder across the polished mahogany table. "This," he said softly, "is the shield he left for you, the Scion Legacy Trust." He opened the binder, and the scale of her father's secret life unfurled before her. It was more staggering than she could have possibly imagined. Page after page detailed holdings in companies she recognized as titans of industry. There were early-stage investments in tech firms that had since revolutionized the world, generating returns that were thousands of times the initial outlay. There were vast portfolios in renewable energy and biomedical research. It was a visionary collection of assets built not on speculation, but on a deep belief in the future. "Your father never stopped being an investor," Walter explained. "He simply did it his way, quietly, ethically, and from a distance. The trust has been compounding for over 20 years, managed by a small, dedicated team, completely invisible to the outside world." Then Walter turned to the final section of the binder. "And this," he said, his voice lowering slightly, "is what I believe you came here for." He pointed to a line item under the heading Strategic Holdings. Her breath hitched. The trust held 1,500,000 Class A voting shares of Cranston Holdings purchased over a decade ago during a market downturn. 15%, Madeline whispered, tracing the name with a trembling finger. "What does that mean in practical terms?" "In practical terms," Walter said, leaning forward, "it means that you are the single largest outside shareholder of your husband's family company. It means no major corporate action, no merger, no significant sale of assets. No change in the corporate charter can happen without your block of votes. For years I have attended their board meetings via proxy, a nameless, faceless representative of an anonymous investor group they call the Hemlock Fund. They have complained about me, courted me, and cursed me, but they have no idea that the power to veto their dynastic ambitions has been sitting in this room the entire time." A cold, hard clarity washed over Madeline, eclipsing her grief. The slap, the humiliation, Genevieve's icy dismissal, they were acts of power committed against someone they believed was powerless. They had fundamentally miscalculated. They had waged war on a pauper, never realizing she was a queen in disguise. A plan began to form in her mind, cold and precise. It was not just about revenge anymore. That felt too small, too petty. This was about justice. It was about protecting her child from the toxic legacy of a family that valued power above all else. This was about cleansing the rot from the inside out. "Walter," she said, her voice now firm, all trace of tremble gone. "I want to understand everything. Every asset, every liability, every weakness in the Cranston Holdings portfolio. I want to know where Isidore has been careless, where his mother has made vanity projects that bleed money. I need their corporate playbook." Walter studied her, seeing the steel that had forged in the fire of her humiliation. He saw her father's analytical mind ignite behind her eyes. "Madeline, you must understand what you are asking. This is a dangerous path. The Cranstons will fight back, and they will fight dirty." "They've already done their worst to me, Walter," she replied, her gaze unflinching. "They tried to break me in the most public way imaginable. They have no idea what I'm capable of now. They're expecting a messy divorce. They're preparing for a PR battle. They are not prepared for a boardroom war." She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. My father built this incredible legacy, this shield. But a shield can also be a weapon. I want you to start quietly acquiring more shares. Use the disposable capital from the tech stocks. I don't want 15%. I want more. Walter nodded slowly, a grim but determined smile forming on his face. And what is the end goal, Madeline? She looked out the window at the Cranston Tower, a monument to arrogance piercing the skyline. The end goal. My husband and his mother believe their name makes them invincible. I'm going to prove them wrong. The end goal is to take their company, their legacy and their name away from them. I am going to leave them with nothing but the consequences of their actions. Over the next few weeks, Madeline underwent a profound transformation. Walter's office became her classroom, and a small, secure apartment she leased became her war room. She traded her designer gowns for sharp business attire, her society luncheons for grueling all-night strategy sessions. She absorbed decades of financial knowledge with a ferocious intensity, her mind sharp and focused. The walls of her new home were not decorated with art, but with stock charts, corporate hierarchy, diagrams, and timelines. Meanwhile, the media storm surrounding the slap raged on a gift she hadn't anticipated. The viral video and endless commentary sent Cranston Holdings' stock into a slow, steady decline. While Genevieve was busy issuing press releases and sending Isidore to a sham anger management retreat, she was completely oblivious to the real threat. She was treating a mortal wound with a bandage. Underneath the cover of this public relations chaos, Walter's traders began their silent assault. Following Madeline's direction, they used 3 different brokerage houses, buying small, irregular blocks of shares to avoid triggering automated trading alerts. Slowly, methodically, the number began to tick upward. 16%, 18%, 21%. Each percentage point was a quiet victory, a tightening of the noose. Madeline was no longer the crying wife who had fled the gala. She was the architect of their ruin, meticulously laying the foundation for their demise. The Cranstons thought they were putting out a fire. They had no idea she was about to unleash a flood. The first tremor hit Cranston Holdings 6 weeks after the gala. Not as a thunderous clap, but as a quiet, insidious vibration that shook the company to its foundation. It arrived in the form of a bland, legally mandated filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission, a document so dense with legalese that its significance was almost missed. Genevieve was in the midst of a tense marketing meeting, discussing a new campaign to rehabilitate the Cranston brand image, when her chief counsel entered the room unannounced, his face ashen. He slid a tablet across the table, a single paragraph highlighted. An obscure investment group, Scion Acquisitions LLC, had officially crossed the 25% ownership threshold in Cranston Holdings, triggering a mandatory disclosure. Genevieve read the paragraph, her eyes narrowing. Scion Acquisitions. I've never heard of them, she said, her voice dripping with dismissal. Find out who they are. It's likely an over-leveraged fund trying to make a quick profit on our depressed stock. Make them an offer, buy them out, and make them disappear. But Scion Acquisitions could not be made to disappear. For 2 days, their team of high-priced lawyers and analysts scrambled digging through corporate registries and financial databases. The result was a frustrating dead end. Scion was a ghost, a financial entity shrouded in a labyrinth of offshore shell corporations, each layer leading to another registered in jurisdictions famed for their impenetrable secrecy. All they could ascertain was that this was not a random accumulation. It was a deliberate, methodical, and incredibly well-funded assault. The predator was inside the walls, but it remained invisible. "It's a hostile takeover, Mother." Isidore recently returned from his retreat with a well-rehearsed narrative of regret, exclaimed, his voice high with panic. The scandal had stripped him of his arrogance, leaving behind a frantic, hunted look. He paced the length of her office, gesturing wildly. "Someone is making a play for the company. It could be the Chen Consortium, or maybe Sterling Cross." "Do not be a fool." Genevieve snapped her own fear, manifesting as icy contempt for her son's weakness. "No one would dare. This is our company. Our name is on the building." But her words rang hollow, a desperate incantation against a gathering darkness. The stock price, which had just begun to stabilize, began to plummet as news of the mysterious new shareholder spread like wildfire through the financial world. Wall Street smelled blood in the water. While chaos reigned in the Cranston Tower, a serene, focused calm pervaded Madeline's new command center. From her sleek, minimalist apartment, she directed her campaign. The space was her war room, filled with monitors displaying not just market data, but leaked internal Cranston emails, architectural plans for their over-leveraged properties, and discreet reports from private investigators detailing Isidore's every move. Walter Hemlock was her general, but she had become the chief strategist, her mind once dedicated to the subtleties of Renaissance art, now demonstrating a terrifying aptitude for corporate warfare. "His profligacy is our greatest weapon," Madeline observed one afternoon, pointing to a spreadsheet on the main screen. "Look here. The Executive Wellness Retreat in Aspen. The invoices show it was booked for 20 executives, but the hotel records Walter's PI obtained show only 2 guests checked into the penthouse suite, Isidore Cranston and Bianca Reed." Walter nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "Your father had an incredible mind for numbers, Madeline, but you have a gift for seeing the story behind them. The narrative. And this is a very damning narrative." Madeline's next move was to deliver that narrative to the world. They carefully selected their weapon, Valerie Kent, the most tenacious investigative journalist at the Financial Chronicle, a Pulitzer Prize winner, with a reputation for being utterly incorruptible. An anonymous, encrypted digital package was sent to her, containing meticulously documented evidence of Isidore's embezzlement. It was a treasure trove of corruption, copies of wire transfers to a shell company owned by Bianca for design consultation on projects that didn't exist, flight manifests for the corporate jet showing dozens of personal trips to Paris, Monaco, and the Caribbean, all billed to the company, and the falsified expense reports from the wellness retreat. Simultaneously, a formal, detailed whistleblower complaint was filed with the SEC's Enforcement Division, ensuring that an official investigation was not just likely, but inevitable. Madeline had laid a perfect trap, and now she waited for it to spring. The headline story broke on a Tuesday morning, and it was an explosion. Cranston heir accused of embezzlement and corporate fraud amidst personal scandal. Valerie Kent's article was a masterpiece of journalistic destruction. It didn't just list the financial crimes, it wove them into the salacious tapestry of his affair with Bianca Reed, juxtaposing multi-million-dollar frauds with details of champagne-fueled parties and extravagant gifts. It painted a portrait of a corrupt, morally bankrupt scoundrel who had used his public company as a personal slush fund to cheat on his pregnant wife. The fallout was catastrophic. The stock nosedived, losing 30% of its value in a single day of frantic trading. The Cranstons were besieged. The board of directors, once a council of loyal sycophants, was now in open rebellion. Philip Crowley, a man who had known Isidore since he was a boy, convened a secret conference call with 4 other senior board members. The sentiment was unanimous: Isidore had to go. He was no longer just an embarrassment. He was a liability that threatened to sink them all. They would demand an emergency board meeting to force his resignation. This was the moment Madeline and Walter had been waiting for. "They will try to cut Isidore loose to save the ship," Walter said, standing beside Madeline as they watched the market chaos unfold on screen. "Genevieve will sacrifice her son to appease the shareholders. She will likely propose herself as the interim CEO, the steady hand to calm the storm." "She'll try," Madeline said, her voice as cold as steel. "But Scion Acquisitions, as the largest shareholder block, will have something to say about that. It's time to call the meeting to a vote. And Walter—" She paused, turning to face him, her expression hardening with resolve. "I will be attending, in person." Walter's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He took a step closer, his voice low and concerned. "Madeline, that's a tremendous risk. You'll be walking into a den of wolves. The moment you walk into that room, you reveal your hand completely. They will be prepared for you in any future negotiations." "This isn't a negotiation, Walter. This is the execution," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "For months they have controlled the narrative. I have been the poor wife, the victim, the commoner who wasn't strong enough. They tried to erase me, to reduce me to a footnote in their sordid story. I will not dismantle their empire from the shadows and let them spin this as some anonymous corporate raid." She walked to the window, looking out at the Cranston Tower, piercing the skyline. "They humiliated me in public in a room full of people. I will have my justice in a room full of people. They need to see my face when their world comes crashing down. They need to know without a shadow of a doubt who did this to them. There will be no ambiguity. There will only be the truth." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. On that morning, Madeline stood before the full-length mirror. The gala felt like a lifetime ago. Then she had chosen a gown to project a soft, hopeful image. Now she fastened the jacket of a bespoke power suit in a deep charcoal grey that was as severe and unforgiving as her intent. Her hair was not in soft waves, but pulled back into a tight, commanding chignon. Her makeup was flawless, a mask of impenetrable confidence. There was no trace of the bruised, weeping woman who had fled the gala. In her reflection, she saw a commander, an heiress not of money, but of a quiet librarian's hidden strength. She was her father's daughter, and she was ready for war. The Cranston Holdings boardroom was on the top floor of the tower, a sterile, glass-encased chamber designed to make men feel like gods looking down on the city they ruled. But on this day, the mood was not divine. It was funereal. The long obsidian table reflected the grim faces of the board members, the air thick with the unspoken terror of a dynasty on the brink of collapse. They were the city's old guard men who had sat on this board for decades, their fortunes and reputations inextricably linked to the Cranston name. Now that name was poison, and they could feel the ground shifting beneath their expensive leather chairs. Genevieve Cranston sat at the head of the table, a grim monarch presiding over a crumbling kingdom. She had spent a sleepless night marshalling her forces, calling in favors, and reminding board members of past loyalties. She looked outwardly compcentre, her posture rigid, her expression a mask of severe control. But inwardly, a frantic energy buzzed beneath her skin. Isidore was a necessary sacrifice, a weak link she had to sever to save the whole. Her plan was simple: express profound disappointment in her son announce his immediate and permanent removal from all corporate duties and position herself as the steady, experienced hand to guide the company through the storm. She believed she had secured just enough proxy votes to maintain control. Her primary concern was the representative from Scion Acquisitions. She pictured some slick, pinstriped corporate raider from a rival firm, a shark smelling blood and circling for a piece of her empire. She was prepared for a fight, ready to negotiate, to cede a few board seats to offer anything short of outright surrender. The heavy oak doors to the boardroom opened. Her head of security leaned in his face, pale. "The representative from Scion Acquisitions is here." "Send them in," Genevieve commanded, her voice like cracking ice. She clasped her hands on the table, bracing for the confrontation. The doors swung wide, and Madeline walked in. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A wave of silent shock washed over the room. The low, anxious chatter ceased as if a switch had been flipped. Bernard Shaw, the portly chairman, let a pen drop from his nerveless fingers, the clatter echoing unnaturally in the sudden stillness. Every head turned, every jaw hung slightly slack. They were seeing a ghost, a spectre from the tabloids, the weeping, humiliated wife from the gala video. But the woman who entered was no ghost. She was a vision of cold, controlled power. Genevieve's face, a carefully constructed facade of authority, disintegrated in seconds. A flicker of confusion gave way to wide-eyed disbelief, which in turn curdled into a dawning, horrified comprehension. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a pasty, waxen grey. She looked as though she'd been struck. "You—" She breathed the word, a ragged, strangled sound that carried all of her shock and revulsion. Madeline didn't spare her a glance. Her gaze, sharp and appraising, swept over the stunned faces of the board members, cataloguing their reactions. She walked with a deliberate, unhurried pace, her heels clicking a steady, resolute rhythm on the marble floor. Walter Hemlock followed a step behind his calm demeanor, and the heavy leather briefcase in his hand, lending an immediate air of gravitas and undeniable legal authority. Madeline stopped at the empty seat, directly opposite Genevieve. A queen claiming her place on the battlefield. She placed her hands on the back of the chair, but did not sit. "Mrs. Cranston," Bernard Shaw stammered, finding his voice at last as he pushed his glasses up his nose. "Madeline, we weren't expecting you. This is a private meeting for board members and invited representatives. This is highly irregular." "What is irregular, Mr. Shaw?" Madeline asked, her voice cool and clear, amplified by the room's perfect acoustics. She finally turned her eyes to him, and he flinched under the intensity of her gaze. "Is it that a significant shareholder has decided to attend a meeting that will determine the future of her investment? Or is it that you simply assumed that shareholder would be a man?" Bernard flushed a deep crimson and sank back in his seat, utterly silenced. Genevieve, recovering a sliver of her composure, sneered. "Enough of this charade. What is this, a pathetic, vengeful little stunt? Did you come here to beg for a more generous divorce settlement?" "I am not here for a settlement, Genevieve," Madeline replied, using the older woman's first name with a chilling familiarity that stripped her of her matriarchal status. "I am here for my company." She pulled out the chair and sat a picture of absolute command. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Madeline Cranston. I am the sole beneficiary of the Scion Legacy Trust, the holding company for Scion Acquisitions LLC. We are, as of the market's opening this morning, the proud owners of 32% of this company's voting shares. Please, let's begin." A collective gasp went through the room. 32%. It was an insurmountable figure. They were no longer in a negotiation. They were in a hostage situation. Madeline continued her tone, shifting from introduction to indictment. For years you have all sat in this room and enabled the Cranstons to run this company like a personal fiefdom. You have rubber-stamped vanity projects and turned a blind eye to gross financial mismanagement, all in the name of loyalty to a family that saw you as nothing more than courtiers. Her gaze landed on Genevieve. You and your son have treated shareholder funds as your private piggy bank. You've fostered a culture of corruption and arrogance that has now predictably led to a full-blown SEC investigation, federal fraud charges for your son, and a brand that is globally recognized as toxic. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the suffocating silence. Your stock has lost nearly half its value. Your corporate partners are fleeing. Your reputation is in ashes. And you, Genevieve, called this meeting to ask for the authority to continue your disastrous reign. The arrogance is truly breathtaking. She gestured to Walter, who proceeded to place a thick, spiral-bound document in front of each board member. The cover read, Scion Acquisitions LLC, a proposal for the restructuring and salvaging of Cranston Holdings. This is our proposal, Madeline announced. It is non-negotiable. It calls for the immediate removal of both Isidore Cranston and Genevieve Cranston from the board of directors and any and all positions, executive or advisory, within Cranston Holdings and its subsidiaries, effective immediately. Panic erupted. A board member named Philip Crowley, a long-time Cranston loyalist, sputtered, "This is absurd. Genevieve has dedicated her life to this company, and we can all see the results," Madeline shot back without missing a beat. "Loyalty is a fine sentiment, Mr. Crowley, but it doesn't excuse fiduciary negligence. Your duty is to the shareholders, not to a failing dynasty, and I am the largest shareholder." She leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly but losing none of its intensity. Failure to ratify this proposal will result in the following Scion acquisitions will immediately initiate a tender offer to buy a controlling 51% of the company on the open market. Given the depressed stock price your mismanagement has created, this will be neither difficult nor expensive. Upon succeeding, our first act will be to dissolve the entire current board. All of you will be removed. Your golden parachutes will be challenged in court, and your professional reputations will be permanently tethered to the Cranston legacy of failure. It was a masterstroke of corporate warfare. She wasn't just threatening Genevieve. She was threatening all of them, their fortunes, their legacies. She had turned their self-interest into her most powerful weapon. "This is my family's company," Genevieve shrieked, her carefully controlled mask finally shattering completely. She stood up, her knuckles white where she gripped the table. "My father built this from nothing. You cannot do this. You are correct. It was your family's company," Madeline said, her voice softening into something even more lethal pity. "But you forgot the first rule of business. You don't own a public company, the shareholders do. And right now, the most significant shareholder is me. The woman your son beat in public. The woman you tried to discard like trash. Now, Mr. Shaw, I believe it is time to call a vote." The vote was a mere formality, a public execution. Bernard Shaw, looking utterly defeated, called each board member's name. One by one, the ayes came, some reluctant, some firm. Each one a nail hammered into Genevieve's coffin. Crowley, aye. Thompson, aye. With each vote, Genevieve seemed to shrink, the life force draining from her until she sank back into her chair, a hollowed-out shell of the titan she once was. The vote was unanimous. As the meeting adjourned in a flurry of nervous energy, Genevieve remained frozen. Madeline rose and walked around the table, stopping directly in front of the once-feared matriarch. The other board members scurried away, not wanting to be near the final devastating exchange. "I will be raising my child to carry the Cranston name," Madeline said, her voice now quiet for Genevieve's ears alone. "But he will not be raised with your values of cruelty and entitlement. He will learn what your father knew and what you clearly forgot, that a name is worthless if the people who carry it have no honor. I will make the Cranston name mean something again, something you and Isidore destroyed." She looked at the broken woman before her one last time. "For what it's worth, I want to thank you. You and your son, you taught me a valuable lesson. You showed me the cage I was in, and then you gave me the rage I needed to break it open." With that, she turned and walked towards the doors, not looking back. The echo of the slap in the ballroom had finally faded, replaced by the deafening silence of absolute victory. Madeline stepped out of the boardroom and into the light, leaving Genevieve Cranston alone in the dark with the ruins of her empire. Madeline Cranston didn't just rebuild her life. She redefined a legacy. As the new chairwoman of the rebranded Scion Holdings, she purged the corruption invested in ethical ventures and turned the company into a model of modern corporate responsibility. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Thomas, named after the quiet librarian who had given her the strength to fight back. Isidore, facing federal charges and abandoned by everyone, pleaded guilty and received a prison sentence. Genevieve faded into obscurity, a bitter recluse in a mansion she could no longer afford. The story of Madeline Cranston became a legend in the business world, a testament to resilience and the quiet power that can rise from the ashes of betrayal. Her journey shows us that true strength isn't about the name you carry, but the character you build. If you were moved by Madeline's fight for justice, please hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their own power. Don't forget to subscribe and to turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story of incredible real-life karma and triumph. Thank you for listening.